Why is it important for communities of color to participate in clinical trials?
The most important reason for communities of color to participate in clinical trials is so that we can make better drugs. And these better drugs are for everyone. And so that is the number one most important reason. But there are a lot of barriers to participation in clinical trials. I think number one barrier that I'll come back to is mistrust. But then there are other barriers in terms of participation in clinical trials. This includes competing demands. Again, since clinical trials for many people are optional, if it's not convenient, or if it's the clinical trial site is located somewhere far away and they're not able to get to it, it can be a barrier to participation. Their fear of potential safety effects, and I know that for some people, this is a fear that some have expressed regarding the COVID studies. There is also stigma sometimes with people being in clinical trials, especially for clinical trials as it relates to mental health. There can be a barrier to clinical trials. For instance, if there's any legal status question for some of your family members and providing that additional information in the clinical trials, you have a fear that there could be repercussions for your family members. But most importantly, there's a lack of access to information from clinical trials because of the implicit and explicit bias in the healthcare system, where people of color are not being offered clinical trials at the same rate as their Caucasian peers. But going back to mistrust, I want to talk more about this because there's a history of mistrust when it comes to clinical trials. And one study that many people point to is the Tuskegee study that was done. And in the study, men who had syphilis were recruited into the study and monitored for years, decades actually, to assess the evolution of syphilis, despite the fact that during that time, a cure was found, basically, which was penicillin. And so there were trials related to Tuskegee. And in fact, we are at the 42nd, I believe, anniversary of the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was really triggered by Tuskegee and other incidences of wrongdoing in clinical trials in order to, number one, research what happened, why is this happening, and then what can we do to improve, to make sure something like Tuskegee never happens again, and to make sure clinical trials are safe and equitable for all people. And from the Belmont Report, there were three basic principles that came out, three initial basic principles of clinical trials, and that was respect for persons, so really providing informed consent so that the person, individual who's going to be participating understands everything that's going on and can make that decision about whether they want to participate. There's also beneficence, so making sure you weigh the benefits and risks of the trial for the patient, and it should, in general, should weigh towards benefits. And this is what we want for all drugs or all trials, drug and non-drug. And then justice, meaning there should be some fair and equitable distribution of the benefits of the clinical trial, and no one group should be unduly burdened. For instance, prisoners, you shouldn't test on prisoners, number one, because they're a vulnerable population, but then you shouldn't unduly burden communities. And so since then, the industry has put together guidelines, and there's many regulatory guidelines regarding conducting of clinical trials, but the mistrust still persists in many communities. And so this is why we end up seeing lower rates of communities of color, patients from communities of color enrolling in clinical trials. in addition to the implicit and explicit bias in healthcare where principal investigators, coordinators, or even referring physicians aren't telling patients about clinical trials, or think, for instance, with an African-American patient, oh, they won't understand and it will take too long to explain everything. So we're just not even going to try to see if they're eligible for this trial. That creates health disparities, but most importantly, it creates a skewing in terms of the population that's represented in the trials. And this population may not be reflective of the population that may eventually be treated. So it's very important for us to have a diverse group of patients in our clinical trials, because eventually we can use that to make better medicines. And just the last note, I think we have to shift in terms of the way we look at clinical trials. Just like blood donors and organ donors, people who participate in clinical trials are heroes. They are, they're going in to help with an investigational medicine. Sometimes it could be a non-drug or digital tool, but they are really pioneers in this area. And we should have as much respect as we do for blood donors and organ donors for patients and people who participate in clinical trial, because it really helps the greater good and it provides for the public health. And I speak in particular for those people who have been participating in COVID trials, because this and the results from all of these trials is going to benefit the greater good, the public health, and help us hopefully get out of this crisis. So thank you.